Thank you for tuning in to the Voice of the Victim podcast. We discuss a lot of sad and potentially triggering things on this show. We try to be as sensitive and cautious as possible, but if you are sensitive to things involving abuse and may be triggered, please think twice before listening to our show.
Welcome to the Voice of the Victim podcast. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Rosie.
How are you doing today, Rosie?
I'm good. I had a real terrible situation. I lost my charger cord.
Oh, yeah, for your inflatable
for my paddleboard. And it really took a toll. But I found it, and now I'm okay.
At the time we were planning to sit down to record, Rosie's running around the house in a panic, looking for her charger.
Well, because if it was gone, then I'd have to buy a whole new inflator, which is not an option. I don't want to do that.
So we ended up starting our recordings 40 minutes later than we planned because it's really hard to record when something else is on your mind.
And it was on my mind.
I could tell.
Anyway, I'm okay now.
Better find this charger before we...
Oh, it just really irked me. It was very, very bad.
Well, I'm glad you found not the charger you were looking for, but one that will work. Mm-hmm. So we're recording in the morning for a change. I guess actually now it's afternoon because we just got done recording, what would it be called? An accompanying episode for Patreon? Cousin episode for Patreon that goes alongside this episode, where we review some of the tapes that have to do with this case. So that'll be over on Patreon. Speaking of Patreon, we want to thank our newest patron and friend,
Gabby.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Shout out to Gabby.
I hope this shout out makes Josiah feel bad and put you in the spotlight of being a better friend. Just kidding.
Wow. Really nice of you.
I'm just joking around.
Anyway, yes, thank you, Gabby. We appreciate you, and we appreciate all of our patrons. It's really cool. So before we get into the episode, we're going to share a review. It comes in from Kristen Hotchkiss, who has she sent a lot of emails to us, and just really nice emails. We appreciate you. Hope you're doing well during this crazy time. But you want to read the review?
It says, I love you both. I've been listening to you two at work for a while now. I love how personable you both are and how real and raw you are. You don't edit out mistakes. You don't sound like a robot. You know how to laugh at yourselves, which is so rare these days.
I mean,
we do
trust
edit
me, we
a lot
do
of
edit
mistakes.
out a lot of mistakes.
But some just slip through.
Yeah, it's impossible to get them all.
Rosie, you really touched me when you started tearing up at the Shania Davis case. Ryan is just adorable because just by listening, I can feel the love he has for you, Rosie. You two are amazing. Don't let any negative comments get you down. You both are amazing, and I respect you for keeping it real. From North Idaho, I send y'all some love. Also, thank you both for sharing your personal stories with us. Vulnerability is such a scary thought, but I respect you both for being so open and vulnerable with us.
That's so nice.
Super nice. A really nice, real and raw review, even though we sure do edit.
Yeah.
You sure do edit.
But thank you, Kristen. That's really sweet. I don't feel like we deserve it.
I think we do a little
bit. No comment. Let's get into the story. As if last week's episode wasn't controversial enough, this week we're talking about another case that was shockingly controversial as I was learning about it. It's the story of the kidnapping of Patricia Hearst. And I'd actually never heard of it before, but it was a pretty big deal back in the 70s and even up to the 90s and early 2000s. I wanted to talk about it because when I first read the story, the way it all played out seemed ludicrous to me. It just didn't make sense how things could happen this way. And then when I dug into it more, watching videos on YouTube and reading comments, the overwhelming majority of the comments were basically saying that Patty Hearst was not a victim, she's a criminal. So It sounds pretty absurd to say about a kidnapping victim, but to truly wrap your head around it, you need to hear the whole story. So, Rosie, are you ready to get into this?
I sure am. Patricia Campbell Hearst Shaw was born on February 20th, 1954 in Los Angeles, California. Her parents were Catherine Wood Campbell and Randolph A. Hearst.
And Randolph Hearst was one of the youngest sons of William Randolph Hearst, who was a pretty big deal in the U.S. in the early 1900s. He served on the House of Representatives from 1903 to 1907, and he also owned the nation's largest newspaper chain and media companies after acquiring the New York Journal. Actually, the movie Citizen Kane is loosely based off of this guy's life. So Patricia's grandpa was a pretty big deal, meaning her family was very wealthy, and this was a high-profile case. And you'll see why she was the target.
Patricia was the third daughter born to Randolph A. Hearst, who eventually became chairman of the board for his father's media company. He had 2 more daughters after Patricia, so she was the middle of 5 daughters. She attended a series of private Catholic schools growing up, including in Los Angeles, San Mateo, Crystal Springs, and Monterey, California. While she was in high school, a young teacher named Stephen Weed began tutoring her in math, and she was able to graduate high school a year early. Nice. Well, I don't know how seriously I would take a tutor with the last name Weed in California. Then she attended courses at Menlo College, where she earned the Best Student Award for her freshman year.
So, Best Student Award, Patricia seemed to have a bright future ahead of her. You know, she wasn't squandering the great opportunities she'd been given, but she seemed to be doing the best she could with all these opportunities she has.
Now, at some point, she started dating that tutor, Stephen Weed. And he actually went on to receive a graduate fellowship and teaching grant at the University of California. By this point, things were getting pretty serious between the two of them, and they got engaged. At age 19, Patricia moved in with her fiancé to an apartment in Berkeley, where she enrolled for her sophomore year of college. The two of them planned to get married in the summer of 1974.
I heard her parents really didn't approve of her relationship with Stephen. You know, she came from a very wealthy, high-class family, and he was a teacher.
Was he a little older than her?
Yes, he was. If you look at pictures, he does look quite a bit older than her. But anyway, she's in a wealthy family. He's a teacher, so there may have been some class disparagement there from her family, but you can't stop young love.
Sure can.
So by February of 1974, she was living with her fiancé. According to Jeffrey Toobin, who recently wrote a book about Patty Hearst, he says that she was very unhappy at this time. He says she didn't really like her fiancé that much, and neither did her mother. But regardless of that, she was living with him and planned to marry him.
Well, that's weird. At 9:17 p.m. on the night of February 4th, 1974, less than 3 weeks before her 20th birthday, Patricia was sitting on the couch next to her fiancé, settling down for the night. She was only wearing a bathrobe and slippers over a pair of panties when they heard a knock on the door.
So, obviously, they weren't expecting any guests at this time. They're settling in for the night in her pajamas, basically. And also, their front door wasn't just on the street. It was an upper-level walkway on the side of an apartment building. So, if a random person from campus was just stumbling by, they would have to go up the stairs and walk around the side to get to the front door. So it's not just some person stumbling off the street. It's an intentional knock. So they're thinking it could have been one of their neighbors that needed something.
Stephen and Patricia both got up and walked to the door. He cracked it a bit and saw a woman standing outside looking shaken up and a bit disheveled. When she saw them, she said, "I'm sorry, but I think I backed into your car. Can I use the phone?"
So this seems innocent enough, but
yeah.
When Patricia heard this, she was a bit perturbed, thinking that this person just damaged her car, so she turned around and walked away kind of in a huff, leaving Stephen to deal with the visitor.
Would it have been obvious that it was their car she hit if it was such a weird walkway?
Well, it's in an apartment, so I think there might be a special parking spot for each apartment.
Oh, okay.
You know?
But as she was walking away, she heard a loud crash and looked back to see 2 armed men push their way into the apartment. One of the men shouted, "Where's the safe?" Stephen told them that there was no safe as he grabbed his wallet and handed it to the men, telling them it was all the money he had and to take anything that they wanted.
So Stephen was willing to give up anything he had to keep himself and Patty safe, but these armed men were not happy with this. They were under the impression that, Patty's from a really rich family, and they assumed all rich people just had a safe in their house filled with cash. So they weren't going to take just this wallet with whatever was in it, and they smacked Steve in the head with a homemade blackjack, which is basically a hunk of lead wrapped in leather with a handle strap. It's basically the thug's equivalent to bricks in a purse.
Yikes. Undeniably, this really took it out of Stephen, who was almost knocked unconscious by the blow.
And he was all bloody.
Oh, I'm sure he was bloody. Yuck.
Ugh.
Patricia made her way to the kitchen to get away from the madness, but the woman who had knocked at the door chased her and held a pistol to her face, telling her to be quiet and nobody will get hurt. Well, that's not true, because Stephen's already bloody and on the floor.
Yeah, I guess no one will get hurt anymore. But after this, the woman tied up Patricia, gagged her with a racquetball, and blindfolded her. Now, Patricia obviously fought back as much as she could, and she was able to shake the blindfold loose, but, she was still bound. And one of their campus neighbors, named Steve Senega, I should have looked this up, but he heard the commotion coming from their apartment and was concerned, as you would be.
He walked over to their open door and peeked his head in to see if everything was okay. But he was caught off guard by the intruders, and they forced him onto the ground face down and tied him up alongside the other two. Patricia begged the intruders to leave them alone, but they snapped back at her, "Quiet, or we'll have to knock you out." At this point, the woman said to one of the men, "They've seen us. We've got to kill them."
So imagine you're these people's neighbor, and you've just come over to check on them, and then you get sucked into this situation?
Yeah.
Yikes.
After hearing this, that neighbor popped his head up in terror, and that got him beaten in the head 3 times with a machine gun.
Yeah.
This poor guy.
He was just
Trying to be a good neighbor.
This is why people are scared to step in when something's happening, because you get sucked into this. Oh my gosh. So just after this happened, Stephen Weed, the fiance, he had recovered a little bit from the blow to the head, and so he suddenly got up and sprinted towards the window, and he actually busted the screen right out of the window, jumping through it, and ran away as fast as he could, jumping over a fence. And he was just peace out.
The adrenaline.
Yeah, but Patricia and the neighbor, Steve, remained tied up, so really heroic move there.
Well, maybe he was trying to get help.
True.
After this, one of the men dragged Patricia out of the apartment, down the stairs, while the other man shot at anyone on campus who came outside, concerned about the commotion.
Yeah, there's basically...
Oh my gosh.
They're in a campus. People are coming outside, and they're getting shot at. These people were just brazen.
Yeah.
In the way they tried to accomplish things.
The woman jumped into the passenger seat of a 1964 Chevy Impala, where another woman was waiting in the driver's seat. The man dragged Patricia out to the car, kicking and screaming, and opened the already popped trunk of the car, but he accidentally let go and it shut on him. So he had to set Patricia down and get the key from the woman in the driver's seat. But Patricia used this as an opportunity to run, after managing to wiggle out of the nylon ties that she was bonded with. She ran into her garage where her car was parked, but before she could shut the door, the man caught up with her again, and this time he was able to throw her into the trunk of the car.
Now...
What a scene.
I know. And like the little glimmer of hope she had of getting away, and then he caught her anyway. But now she's in this trunk, and it's February in Berkeley, California, which is a lot further north than LA, so it gets chilly in Northern California. And it was in the 40s that night, Fahrenheit. So it was cold. She was only wearing a bathrobe and panties, and she had no idea what was going on or how long she'd be back there, what was going to happen to her. It would be terrifying and so uncomfortable.
So Patty's in the trunk, and the rest of the kidnappers get into the car, which they had stolen from a man named Peter Benenson earlier that day. And poor Peter was unloading his groceries in his driveway.
I know. Can you imagine you're at your own home and unloading groceries when this happens? And they didn't just take his car.
Right. Poor Peter was still tied up in the back seat of his car, wrapped in a blanket and unconscious after getting pistol whipped by the same woman who knocked on Patricia's door.
So, let's talk about who these kidnappers are.
All right. The first woman who knocked on the door was Angela Atwood, a local stage actress. She had been very charismatic and passionate in high school, being a part of many student leadership groups and even captain of the cheerleading squad. She also performed as the star in many musicals and had a knack for befriending the kids in school that others saw as outcasts.
So, from that history, she sounds like a pretty great person, but now she's using her acting talents to kidnap somebody? So what the heck went wrong here?
The other woman who waited in the getaway car was Camila Hall. She was actually from the Minneapolis area where we live, and she had been a poet and an artist and even a social worker. But she left that all behind when she joined the movement, which all these kidnappers were a part of, the SLA, or Symbionese Liberation Army.
Yeah, so again, she was a social worker. She actually went to school to try to help people, and now she's part of kidnapping.
The man who had dragged Patty out of the apartment was named Bill Harris. He had formerly served in the Vietnam War, and he was married to Emily Harris, who was also part of the SLA. The SLA was led by another one of the kidnappers named Donald DeFries, but he went by the name Sin-Q. This man had a lot different past than the other three we've talked about.
Yeah, so we're going to dive into his past in more detail since he's the one that started this movement. So we can kind of get a feel for his background and also just the inconsistencies in what he claims to want and what he actually does. But we'll get into that. So tell us about Donald DeFries, Rosie.
Well, he grew up as the oldest of 8 children. His mother was a nurse in Cleveland, Ohio, where they lived, but his father was very violent. At 3 different times while growing up, his dad had punished him by breaking both of his arms.
Yeah, so he had a really rough childhood. There's no denying that.
So when he was 14 years old, he ran away from home, dropped out of school, and made his way to Buffalo, New York, where he came in contact with a local fundamentalist minister, Reverend William Foster. Reverend Foster saw a lot of potential in the young boy, saying he had a heart as big as a house. He actually went on to take Donald in and let him live with them.
So, this is crazy. Like, he was literally an abuse victim when he was a child, and he had to run away from home because conditions were so bad. And he was taken in by a minister who saw the potential in him and saw how, like, he had a big heart. Mm-hmm. So how did he get to a point where he could kidnap a woman?
Well, later on, Donald became involved with some street gangs that would steal money from parking meters, and at some point, he helped steal a car. But he was caught and arrested for this and sent to a state reformatory in Elmira, New York.
Now, according to Donald, quote, "Life in the prison, as we called it, was nothing but fear and hate, day in and day out. I would not be part of any of the gangs, black or white. I didn't hate anyone, black or white, and they hated me for it." So, I mean, I respect the words he's saying here. And yeah, he made some dumb mistakes after getting mixed up with the wrong crowd. But again, he'd been horribly abused, and he seemed to have a good heart, according to the people who knew him. Mm-hmm. So again, like, it's not all hope lost at this point.
Well, yeah, and like the crimes that he committed weren't that serious. I mean, the stealing a car is serious, but stealing money from the parking meters? Mm-hmm. I wonder if going to the state reformatory like made his attitude worse than better.
That's a good point, because he was still pretty young. Mm-hmm. But like you said, not super serious crimes. So how did he go from this type of crime to crimes harming other people?
Well, after prison in 1963, he moved to Newark, and married a woman named Gloria, who had 3 kids from a previous marriage.
Well, that's Newark, New Jersey, just to clarify.
I know.
There's also a Newark in California.
That's right.
So,
But the following year, in 1964, she had him arrested for desertion. He later said that the worries of trying to support the children engulfed him, and wrote, "I just couldn't take it anymore. I was slowly becoming a nothing."
yeah, so
Wow.
he definitely should not have married a woman with children, given his problems with, it seems like he has this sense of grandeur almost, like he wants to achieve something more exciting than just being a family man. There's another side to it that he has such a desire to do things just right and perfectly that if he can't meet his own expectations, he goes into a depression and runs away. So that could have been a part of it too. But after he left his wife and children, he got into some trouble.
Yeah. In 1964, he was found with a tear gas pencil bomb, a sharpened butter knife, which is like, why didn't you just have a steak knife?
Right.
Anyway, and a sawed-off rifle in his suitcase while trying to hitchhike on the San Bernardino Freeway near West Covina, California.
West Covina, that sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Little tiny plug from my new favorite show, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. He had a sharpened butter knife. This was so like, why, dude? Why'd you just grab a steak knife? I don't know. I think that's funny.
I know. If he had a sawed-off shotgun.
And also, like, well, for what purpose did you have these items? But
yeah.
Anyway.
It's a good question. So now, after all this, he returned to his wife and children and moved the whole family to California from New Jersey.
He was arrested again in 1965 after firing a gun in the basement of his home. Wow, that's really not a great idea.
Yeah.
He later said he played with guns and fireworks to get away from how unhappy his life was. But the charges were dropped for this. I didn't know you could get arrested for shooting a gun in your basement.
Well, I think it's putting people in danger.
True. In 1967, he was stopped again for running a red light on his bike.
I didn't know you could get arrested for running a red light on your bicycle.
Donald probably didn't know that either.
But again, he was found with a homemade bomb in his pocket.
Donald!
And another bomb and a pistol in the basket of his bicycle. I love that he's riding a bicycle with a basket on it.
Don's making some bad decisions
with that red light in your bicycle with a basket.
If I was a cop, I'd just be like, buddy, why didn't you just stop at the light? Like, all this stuff in your pockets? Like, dude. Well, the police asked him what he was doing with all this stuff, and he said that he'd found them and was trying to sell them to cover expenses of caring for his family. I don't know if I'm buying it, but also, who just has stuff like that on a bike?
It's kind of a Boy Who Cried Wolf situation where it's happened so many times that, like, you can't really take his word for it here.
Yeah. After this, he was given 3 years of probation, but his probation officer wrote an interesting report about his case. He wrote, "The difficulties which the defendant has encountered in his life are real and serious. He feels his responsibilities deeply and is overcome when he cannot meet them. He appears to have a warm relationship with his wife and children. The type of behavior encountered in the present offense appears to be the defendant's way of compensating for feelings of inadequacy and powerlessness. The defendant is potentially dangerous if he again encounters such severely threatening circumstances as he was encountering at the time of the offense."
So, interesting comments here about the character of this guy. Because as this probation officer saw it, he was almost like he had a sense of inadequacy and powerlessness, and he was trying to do everything perfectly to compensate for that. So it's an interesting combination, but it also shows where his life leads from this point, the founding of the SLA, which we mentioned earlier, and the ideals of that, why he would be trying to accomplish the things that he set out to with the SLA, because It talks about feelings of powerlessness, and this was SLA was a group that literally declared war on the government. So it's, it kind of makes sense with this analysis here.
Right.
That he's trying to feel some kind of power.
Well, another probation report described Donald as a schizoid personality with strong schizophrenic potential, who had a fascination with firearms and explosives. Well, I got the firearms and explosives part for sure.
And this is the only thing I saw about schizophrenia in this guy, so we don't need to even comment on that. But interesting.
Mm-hmm. Psychiatric officials at the prison recommended that he be jailed, quote, because his fascination with firearms and explosives made him dangerous, which I kind of feel. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you're riding around with a bomb on a bike.
Several different times.
Yeah.
But despite this, he was only given 5 years of probation. And I don't know anything, but I think there should have been a middle ground here. Like, I don't think he should just be thrown in jail because of this. But I also don't think... I think there should have been, like, some kind of psychiatric treatment or therapy instead of just jail or probation, Because now he's out and about, only on probation. And in 1969, again, he ran into more trouble.
Yeah, that year, Donald was again arrested, but for kidnapping the caretaker of a Jewish synagogue with an accomplice. So kind of amping up the crime here.
Yeah.
The accomplice was tried and acquitted, and while Donald was awaiting trial, he had bailed out and made his way back to Ohio, where he was spotted on the roof of a bank in Cleveland on October 11th, 1969, carrying 2 pistols and an 8-inch dagger. They also found a, quote, burglar's toolkit nearby, as well as a hand grenade. But again, he paid the $5,000 bail and returned to L.A. How is he getting all this money?
Right? That makes you wonder how much money he had been stealing that he got away with. Because not everyone can just pay a $5,000 bail.
The next month, on November 17th, 1969, he tried robbing another bank in Los Angeles, where he got into a shootout with the police and was injured. This time, he was convicted for stealing $1,000 in cashier's checks and was sent to the Vacaville? Is that how you say that?
I think so.
Vacaville prison. After this, the synagogue kidnapping charges were dropped since he was already in prison.
Which...
Not a big deal.
How did it take this long, though? Like, so many encounters with the police, I'm surprised he was still eligible for bail.
I hope the caretaker was okay with the synagogue.
Oh, yeah.
They didn't really tell us much. During his incarceration at this prison, he joined a group called the Black Cultural Association, which had connections to the Berkeley College through Professor Colston Westbrook.
Now, this group would set up visits by the students to the prison to help educate prisoners on politics. And through this arrangement, Donald was apparently introduced to some, quote, far-left radicals whose ideas he really liked. And after this, he diverged from the Black Cultural Association to form his own group, which he called Unisite.
This group would later transform into the Symbionese. Can you tell me how to say that?
Symbionese. It's like symbiotic.
Got it. Symbionese Liberation Army.
So Donald claimed that his goal, with his new group was the unification of all people, regardless of skin color. The name Unisite, as in one shared vision. And then Symbionese, which, basically having a group of people with a symbiotic relationship or mutually beneficial and united relationship. So on the outside, his goal sounds good, but it's all about the execution, and we'll get into more of that later.
In December of 1972, he was transferred to the Soledad prison, but on March 5th of 1973, he escaped from the prison and made his way to Oakland, California, where some friends helped him hide at the home of Patricia Hearst, a.k.a. Ms. Moon.
Yeah, we'll refer to her as Ms. Moon from now on.
It's actually kind of a cool name. She would go on to officially found the SLA with Donald DeFreeze, and this is when he adopted the name Field Marshal Cinque.
Yeah, so he actually got this name from the leader of a slave rebellion in 1839 who took over the Spanish slave ship Amistad, and this guy's name was Joseph Cinque. And then Ms. Moon also introduced him to Camilla Hall, who would later join the group and assist him in the kidnapping of Patricia Hearst. So his group is starting to form.
Mm-hmm. His social circle continued to widen after the group was formed, and soon Angela Atwood joined the group at age 25. But sadly, the SLA actions were not correlating with their self-proclaimed goals. On November 6, 1973, just a few months before Patricia's abduction, members of the SLA took the life of the superintendent of Oakland Unified School District, Marcus Foster. They claimed that the reason they killed him was because he allegedly supported a plan to create student ID cards for the school, which would help keep non-student drug dealers off the campus.
So
I'm not really getting the problem.
Yeah, I don't know why this would be such a problem for a group claiming to be doing good things for people, or how they could possibly justify a murder. I mean, it's ironic. This group claimed to be anti-racist, but they took the life of the first black superintendent in Oakland, California. And another ironic thing is that Foster himself opposed the idea of the ID cards, but others were pushing for it, so it was inevitably going to happen. So the plan he was proposing was actually a watered-down version of the other proposals to try to just make it as uninhibiting as possible.
That's weird.
But this man lost his life over it, and it really shows that no matter what the intentions this group thinks they have, they didn't get all the facts or think things through very well before they did things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're extremely impulsive, and they cause a lot more harm than good, as cults typically do, which is what I would call this.
Oh yeah, me too. Marcus was shot 8 times with hollow point bullets packed with cyanide.
So he had no chance.
His deputy, Robert Blackburn, was also shot in the encounter and was able to survive the attack. 2 members of SLA, Joe Ramiro and Ross Little, were convicted and sentenced to life in prison after this senseless murder. But Russ Little actually filed an appeal and got released after only 5 years.
So that's insane to me.
Life to 5 years? That's unheard of.
I know. But it was actually reported that 3 people were present during this attack, and there's only 2 people who got convicted of it. And Donald DeFreeze, a.k.a. Cinque, was suspected of being that 3rd person. But, you know, he's already escaped from prison. He's keeping a low profile. And the members of his group are protecting their leader for some reason, even after they were arrested and convicted.
Mm-hmm. As we do see in cult-like families.
Yeah, which really shows the control that this group had over their members.
Yeah.
And, you know, which spills over into the control that they would have over Patty Hearst later on, which we'll get to.
Good connection. Marcus Foster was survived by his wife Albertine as well as his daughter Marcia, who went on to become the president of the Ecumenical Theological Seminary in Detroit, Michigan.
Really good job with the pronunciation there.
Thanks. It's not like I asked her anything. She retired in July of 2013 and maintains honorary status there.
So now that we have some history of the SLA, let's get back to Patricia Hearst and the kidnapping, as we left off with her in the trunk of this car.
Mm-hmm. 2 other vehicles from the SLA were parked nearby after Patricia's kidnappers got into the Impala. Bill's wife, Emily Harris, was in a stolen station wagon, along with another SLA member, Nancy Ling Perry. Then a 3rd vehicle, a VW Volkswagen Beetle, was driven by Willie Wolf, the youngest member of the SLA, and Ms. Moon rode along with him.
Now, Willie Wolf was supposed to lead the 3-car caravan of SLA members, with the kidnapper's Impala in the middle and the station wagon in the rear. But something crazy happened after they got on their way.
A police cruiser appeared and flashed their lights at the Beetle, which was leading the way. They pulled over, and the officer got out and talked to Willie and Ms. Moon.
And there was just this huge commotion at this campus where they had taken her. Surely this officer would have heard what was going on, right?
Right. You'd think. Donald DeFreeze and Bill Harris started to panic, realizing they may need to go into battle with this officer. They looked at each other, and without saying a word, they both began to reach for their door handles, firmly grasping the automatic rifles on their laps. But just before they got out, the officer went back to his car and left. He had only stopped them to tell them to turn their lights on. This whole thing could have been...
It was so close.
Yeah.
For these people, because remember, it's not just Patty in the car, it's also the owner of the car that they stole from, Peter Benenson, and they were so close to possibly being rescued. Mm-hmm. But again, this was just a lone officer.
True.
They might have just mowed him down and left anyway, which would have added just another victim. But you want to talk about Peter Benenson a little bit too, because again, another victim in this case.
Right. And if we don't remember, Peter Benenson was the owner of the Impala, and he was tied up in the back seat of the car. And Peter Benenson was a mathematician at Berkeley's Lawrence Radiation Lab. The whole time the kidnapping was taking place, he was held at gunpoint under threat of murder if he didn't comply.
Yeah.
The caravan headed to a safe house in Daly City, taking a long detour over San Mateo Bridge to avoid the Bay Bridge.
And this was part of the plan because they figured if police were checking cars leaving the area of the kidnapping, they'd more likely be doing it on the Bay Bridge than the San Mateo Bridge. So, they had this planned out logistically, but ideologically, it seems like a pretty odd plan for what they say they believe in.
Well, during this hour trip, DeFreeze was cold and commanding, shouting, "Shut up or we'll kill you." But Bill Harris apparently reached back into the trunk and held Patricia's hand.
What do you think of that?
At first I was like, oh, but then no.
This
you
man
kidnapped her. It's weird.
Yeah. I guess he was trying to comfort her, but it's so creepy after you just dragged someone out of their home.
I don't know. He probably thought she was hot or something and just trying to woo
again,
her.
he was married.
Yeah.
His wife was in another car.
Oh, yeah, that's true. The next day, Peter Benenson's sister Anne got a phone call from him, telling her that he was safe, but wouldn't talk to her about what happened.
Yeah, he was shaken up after being terrorized, and it really makes me feel bad for the guy that he just didn't want to talk about it, even with his own sister.
Yeah. After news of the kidnapping spread and the FBI began investigating, they actually told her parents that a few weeks earlier they'd found plans during a raid on an abandoned SLA house detailing plans for Patricia's kidnapping.
Can you believe that?
It's so dumb. Why didn't they do anything then?
Right.
They had her daily routines mapped out with locations of her classes and her address, and it said they planned to act on the quote full moon of January 17th. Although that day came and went, the FBI never took any action to protect Patricia, and her parents were bewildered by this. In response to their confusion, FBI agents shrugged it off, saying they figured they'd be arresting the SLA members any time now, and they had them on the run. Right. Then they said, "Besides, Mrs. Hearst, what could we have done about it?"
And this infuriated Patricia's mom, Catherine, because it's pretty obvious they have all this information written down about her, and she replied the way most people with common sense would.
She said, "We would have taken her out of school, and she would have gotten out of that apartment."
Yeah, I would say if my name was found on a document by a radical group planning out my kidnapping, I would think I'd have the right to be aware of that, you know? Even if the authorities wouldn't help protect me, I'd like to know what info they have on me so I could protect myself. But apparently, the FBI didn't believe Patricia had the right to this knowledge. But, yeah, this becomes a pattern in this case of them really not taking these threats seriously, and then even after Patricia's kidnapping. But before we get to that, why was Patricia kidnapped?
Well, the SLA apparently planned to use her as a bargaining token to get the two men who had killed Marcus Foster freed from prison. They also knew how wealthy and influential her family was, having both money and a massive media corporation with a huge audience.
Yeah, so maybe they thought they could spread their message with the use of this media company. And they also wanted to use Patricia as the poster child face of the movement, using her pre-existing clout as a wealthy heiress to their advantage. And they knew the family had a lot of money that they could use her as a bargaining token to get, you know, some of that money for the benefits of their cause. So a lot of reasons they kidnapped her.
Authorities refused to free the SLA members from prison.
Which, again, like we mentioned earlier, the guy who was sentenced to life got out after 5 years.
Yeah.
And yet, before that, they refused to let them out to save her life, which is understandable because they're murderers. But it's weird that an appeal got him out, but, you know, saving the life of a kidnap victim wasn't high enough on the value list for that.
Right. Next, the group demanded that the Hearst family give millions of dollars to feed poor people in California. So the Hearst family donated $2 million worth of food to the Bay Area food shelves. But then the SLA demanded $4 million more, which Randolph Hearst said he couldn't afford personally. But the Hearst Family Corporation did offer to put the money in an escrow account pending the release of Patricia.
So that seems like a smart solution to try to actually get her back. But it didn't work. And if you listen to the tapes that she had sent, you'll kind of see this back and forth and why it was pretty much impossible to reason with these people or get them to meet in the middle. Like, Rosie, don't you think, did you get that from the tapes?
For sure.
Which, again, we listened to and commented on Patreon, if you're interested.
In the SLA safe house apartment where Patricia was kept, she says her hands were tied, she was blindfolded, and locked in a closet for 57 days. During these 57 days, she was in a constant state of terror, having no clue if or when it would end. DeFreeze, a.k.a. Symbionese, would constantly threaten her with death if she didn't cooperate. She said, quote, "I was afraid to even think any thoughts that were my own."
Yeah, apparently they threatened to harm her for even thinking anything negative about the group because they were afraid that if she did, a psychic would be able to find her. But,
wow, covering all the bases.
Yeah, they imposed complete control over her during this time, and it was stressful and damaging to her. I mean, I can't even imagine being locked in a closet for 30 minutes, but, you know, after going through the trauma of having your home raided by armed gunmen and then being dragged out against your will and thrown in a trunk and locked in a closet with no clue how long you'll be in there.
And being tied up and blindfolded.
Yeah, it's a bad situation for her.
And on top of all that, she says that both Symbionese and Willie Wolf began raping her after Angela Atwood told her that the others in the group wanted to show her what sexual freedom was like in their unit.
What does that mean? Like the freedom to rape someone?
I don't know what it means.
Again, Symbionese was a cult leader, and apparently he could do whatever he wanted.
They would only let her out to eat, but made her wear a blindfold while she ate.
So, obviously she was a victim of horribly life-altering things. I mean, this is why I have a problem with a lot of the opinions floating around out there that seems to be the popular consensus that she was in complete control of her actions this whole time. She wasn't under duress. She wasn't being forced. Just because of what people heard on the tapes. Mm-hmm. Even though those tapes were recorded on an easily editable tape. Like, you could hear cuts almost between every sentence. That, to me, means that they were making sure she said everything exactly the way they wanted her to,
right,
before they sent this tape out. It's not like...
Well, and as the tapes progress, you can hear the change.
Mm-hmm.
And you can just... It's so obvious, the change that she's going through with the beginning of the kidnapping to the end. And
yet people, including the authorities in this case, claim that the actions we're about to talk about were all done by Patricia's free will, and that she could have escaped at any time. But before we go down a rabbit hole and I start complaining about how ridiculous the perception of this case was, let's talk about her situation here more. She was being locked in this closet, blindfolded, hands bound. She was being raped regularly and forced to claim that it was a loving relationship on the tapes. And the only time they'd let her out of the closet for the first 57 days was to eat.
Right.
Which she still had to wear her blindfold.
Right.
So,
and while she was eating, the other SLA members would have political discussions based on their ideology. Patricia began joining in on the conversations.
Yeah. And think about it. This is her only human contact now. She has no idea if they'll ever let her go. And she's in survival mode here, just trying to make the best of the hand she's been dealt. Mm-hmm. And I can't imagine anything more frustrating than being kidnapped, because you have all power taken away from you. You literally are forced to comply, and you have no idea what your future holds. It's just... like, that's such a frustrating, and I can't even imagine the feelings.
At some point, Senkyu told her that the group council had been talking about what they were going to do with her. The two options they came up with were either she joined them in their cause, or they were going to kill her.
So it doesn't really sound like much of a choice to me.
In her own words, Patricia says, "I accommodated my thoughts to coincide with theirs."
Again, she's in survival mode here, trying to make the best of the hand she's been dealt. And they've completely taken away all her power, not to mention the psychological damage of 57 days in a closet after everything else she's gone through. And literally joining their group is the only hope she has left of survival.
Finally, after stating that she would join them, they removed her blindfold, and she saw the faces of the SLA members for the first time. Again, this is after like 3 months, right?
Well, 2 months.
2 months.
57 days.
She was given a flashlight and SLA propaganda tracts to read and study up on her new forced political perspective. She was given daily lessons on her duties, including weapon drills. Almost 2 months had passed since her disappearance on April 3rd, 1974, when a tape was sent to her parents, where she announced that she'd taken the name Tanya and joined the SLA.
So on the outside, this taking the name Tanya and joining the SLA, this is shocking to hear. And we actually listened to those tapes and discussed and reacted to them over on Patreon. But a lot of people point to these tapes to prove that Patricia was completely in control and had made the conscious decision for herself, of her own volition, to join the SLA. Even the media reporting it said, quote, "She announced that she joined the ranks with her kidnappers, and she called herself Tanya. But she said later that I called myself nothing. They called me that. They're the ones that took her identity away. They forced her to record those tapes, and yet the media painted her as the criminal." To me, it's pretty clear that this group had taken any personal agency she had over herself away from her and was forcing her to do these things.
Right.
But that said, now we're going to get into some serious crimes that she was involved in and give our thoughts on that.
On April 15th, 1974, surveillance footage from a bank robbery showed the SLA members, along with Patricia Hearst, in an act of robbery in the Hibernia Bank in Sunset District of San Francisco. She carried an M1 carbine,
which is a semi-automatic firearm.
2 men were shot and wounded after entering the bank during the robbery. In the media and among authorities, they saw Patricia as a common criminal during this robbery and not just a reluctant participant.
I mean, yeah, 2 people got shot and wounded after this, so obviously they have to take this event very seriously. And just looking at the video, she makes it look like she's part of the robbery, like she wants to be there. But again, she needs to put on a good show and make her captors happy.
That's what
They have to be satisfied with her performance.
After watching that video, she doesn't look like, I don't know, as much as you would want to be a reluctant participant. I don't know how you would be able to show that.
Yeah, and
when
not
you're in that
get
situation
beaten afterwards.
Yeah, and I never saw her point a gun at anybody.
Exactly, and I don't even know how people think they could know what Patricia was going through leading up to this just by seeing this little 2-minute video. Like, do they really think they can deduce everything she's thinking and feeling after months of abuse with her kidnappers just from this little video where she's clearly, if you really think about it, under duress and forced into this? And let's share some other factors from the video that made people assume she was doing just fine.
Okay. Well, in the video, she appeared to have long, beautiful, flowing brunette hair, but she said they'd actually shaved her head and made her wear a wig.
So just another way of stripping her of her identity.
She also had been accused of being the driver or taking lead on the robbery, when in reality, she was shoved into the backseat of the car between 2 other SLA members.
Yeah, and there was another thing.
The FBI agent who took the lead on the investigation into the robbery said that SLA members were photographed during the robbery pointing guns at Patricia.
So why would they be pointing guns at their ally unless they had reason to question her loyalty? Now in the tapes, Patricia addresses this, the tapes she sent after the robbery, saying that, she said her gun was loaded and that they never pointed their guns at her. But again, the things she's saying in these tapes are things she's being forced to say, obviously.
Right.
I saw another comment on YouTube that, they had given her a gun. Why didn't she use that to escape? And again, later, after she wasn't under the control of them anymore, she said that the gun they gave her in this first robbery was not loaded or ready for use. It was a prop for that occasion. And to be fair, it's just according to what she says, but
wouldn't that make sense, though?
Yeah.
If they want the media and everybody in the world to think that she's a part of them, then obviously they're going to give her a gun that's not loaded. Because they probably did have a little fear that she would turn on them.
Yeah, this was her first time out with the group since being kidnapped. I mean, it was not long after she sent out the tape saying that she had joined the group. And there's no denying the fact that she was kidnapped against her will. That part is undeniable. So why would they trust her with a working gun for the first time out of the compound just a couple months after the kidnapping? That would just be stupid on their part. But apparently her performance this night, proved her loyalty to them in their minds, because eventually they did give her a working gun.
There was another event on May 16th, 1974, where Bill Harris, the man who carried Patricia out of her apartment and held her hand from the trunk, was caught stealing from Mel's Sporting Goods in Inglewood, California, by the manager. Bill made his way out of the store with the stolen goods to a van across the street where his wife Emily waited along with Patricia. But the manager, accompanied by an employee, followed Bill out and confronted him. Bill refused to cooperate, and this led to a scuffle where the manager restrained Bill and his pistol fell out of his waistband. At this point, Patricia panicked and shot an entire magazine's worth of ammo into the overhead storefront from her semi-automatic carbine. After this, the manager ran behind a light post and tried to shoot back at her, but then she moved her shots closer.
So, by this time, she had a working gun, but from what went down, it's clear that she's not trying to harm anyone. She wasn't shooting to kill. And it seems like she was doing what she could to make the SLA group feel like they could trust her, while at the same time trying not to hurt anyone unnecessarily. Mm-hmm. Because, again, even if she was to use her gun on some members of the SLA, they're all armed too.
Right.
And she's already been taken from her house once. Who's to say they can't find her again and this time kill her?
Mm-hmm. After this incident, Patricia, Bill, and Emily hijacked 2 cars, abducting their owners in the process. The owner of the car that Patricia hijacked was later reluctant to even report her because he found her so personable. She repeatedly asked him if he was okay while she drove.
So
that says a lot about her character, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he didn't even want to tell cops.
Yeah, this person who was just victimized by Patricia, who in his mind, you would think he'd just see as a radical criminal who took advantage of him, but he actually saw good in her. I think that's pretty interesting. And I'm not trying to downplay the illegal things Patricia was doing here, but I think it's really important to remember that she's under duress. She's a kidnapping victim trying to fit in with her captors and stay alive. And like I said, even if she was able to escape, she's been kidnapped once. Once something like that happens to you, you can't trust that you'll ever be safe again. So why would she believe that if she escaped, she would ever be safe? Especially after pledging allegiance to their cause, being forced to do that, they probably wouldn't just kidnap her a second time. They would shoot to kill.
Mm-hmm. On the way back from this incident, police had surrounded the main base of the SLA before they returned. So Bill, Emily, and Patricia hid and stayed away from the place that they had called home.
What are the odds that these 3 would be out and about when the police finally found this safe house?
Mm-hmm. The next day, on May 17th, 1974, there was a raid on that house. And this is the house that Patricia was initially kept, and the 5 members of the SLA who also lived there with them were shot to death in a rain of bullets that set the record at the time for the most rounds ever shot in a residence by the San Francisco police. Sin-Q, Willie Wolfe, Angela Atwood, Nancy Ling Perry, and Ms. Moon were all among those killed in the gunfight. At the start of the gunfight, police began throwing tear gas bombs into the house, and a woman named Christina Johnson stumbled out of the house with her hands bound behind her back, saying that she had been held hostage there. But later, after mowing down the rest of the group, Christina was charged with harboring criminals.
So...
What?
Yeah, I don't quite understand that charge. Was it her home and they had held her hostage to use it as a safe house? I couldn't find that detail.
Or maybe she was faking it, that she was being held hostage and part of the operation?
Maybe. But her hands were bound behind her back when she came out. But it's sad because the reporting of this is what we kind of have to rely on. But the reporting is extremely black and white. There's no nuance or consideration for who the real victims and criminals are. It's just everyone who's near the criminals is bad. End of story.
Right.
And sadly, that's exactly how a lot of the people in the public see this now, because the media is where they got their information, and it was extremely biased. And there are more reasons people come up with to be anti-Patricia, like her family being wealthy, but we'll get into that later. I think it's clear that there are real criminals in this case, and then there are victims of manipulation and coercive control.
Nicely said. During the raid, the house went up in flames, just like the Waco raids. The news reported it as the home inexplicably starting on fire, but we know now how flammable tear gas is. Initially, after this raid, the bodies were so badly burned that they couldn't be identified, so it was unclear whether Patricia Hearst was among the bodies.
Which is really messed up to me. I think it's interesting that they even did such a violent raid, knowing that a kidnapped victim could potentially be inside. I mean, they had no reason to believe she wasn't inside, and this is probably part of the reason she didn't turn herself in after this raid. She just saw that the authorities were 100% willing to kill her based on the appearances she had on the tapes that were sent. Even though those recordings were made under duress, she was being held hostage by evil people when they were recorded. What she said on them is not proof of her actual beliefs, but I can understand her fear of turning herself in because she just watched the police mow down this house where they thought she was being held. And plus, she was still stuck with the man who physically carried her out of her apartment and his wife, Emily. And I should correct myself. In the Patreon episode, I said that she was stuck with her two abductors, but actually Angela, I was getting Angela and Emily mixed up. Angela was killed here. But still, one of your abductors is just as bad. There's a lot of abductions that are just made by one person.
After the raid, Emily attended a rally in Berkeley to commemorate the deaths of Angela Atwood and others who had died in the police siege. Emily recognized Kathy Salaya, who had known Angela from civil rights activist groups she'd been a part of. Kathy introduced the three fugitives to an athletics coach named Jack Scott, who held some radical views and agreed to provide financial aid to help them out.
So right away, Patricia's in the thick of it again. She now has others that are helping out her surviving captor, and even if she wants to escape deep down, there are things that hold victims back from running that most people can't understand. Plus, her identity has been squashed by this group. She has been trained to not have independent thought. So,
well, I'm sure she also felt like if she went back, she was going to be like so criticized and misunderstood by family and media, like we've talked about, that she didn't know if she wanted to go back.
Yeah, again, she just saw that law enforcement was willing to kill her. So, Patricia remained with this group until September of 1975.
And during that time, Patricia reportedly helped make improvised bombs that were placed under police cars in August of 1975. But thankfully, those bombs failed to detonate.
And again, I almost wonder if this was on purpose.
Yeah, maybe. She had also been a getaway driver for another bank robbery in Carmichael, California at the Crocker National Bank. Sadly, during this robbery, another life was senselessly taken. It was early in the morning of Monday, April 21st, 1975. Myrna Opsahl had gone to the Crocker National Bank just to make a quick deposit when armed robbers burst inside and shouted for everyone to get down on the floor, faces on the rug. And immediately, before Myrna even had a chance to process what was happening, Emily Harris, from behind a mask, shot and killed her.
So this just shows how some of the people in this group are so delusional that they're not fighting for the cause that they originally claimed to have. She literally just opened fire immediately and killed Myrna. Myrna was a 42-year-old mother of 4 children, so that's 4 kids who lost their moms in this senseless act. And she was just there depositing collections from the past weekend for the Seventh-day Adventist Church where she was a parishioner. And several of her fellow parishioners were also in the bank at the time she was shot, so they watched her die, her friends. So many people's lives were affected in this short little attack here.
Right. And the robbery was so unnecessarily violent, with Emily and Bill kicking people and stepping on them, shouting profanities at them, and they escaped with only $15,000. So was it even worth it to kill somebody?
Well, that was a lot more money back then.
That's a good point. But still.
Mm-hmm. Well, and no, it wasn't worth it at all. But
the next month, on September 18th, 1975, Patricia Hearst was finally found by police and FBI. She was in an apartment in San Francisco with Wendy Yoshimura, another SLA member at the time.
But when they found Patty, it wasn't the rescue of a kidnap victim. Patty was under arrest. They found money in the apartment where she was, which was traced back to the robbery where Myrna was killed, and they were able to use the markings on the money to do that.
When she was booked, she listed her occupation as urban guerrilla and told her attorney to, quote, "Tell everybody that I'm smiling, that I feel free and strong, and I send my greetings and love to all the sisters and brothers out there."
So, a lot of people, including law enforcement, saw this as a sign that she had willingly chosen to be part of this group, that she was, was actually wanting to be part of their ideals. Even after being with law enforcement and away from the members of this group, she was displaying loyalty to the SLA. But there's a lot more to it than that. I mean, the police find her, and instead of recovering her like the victim of a kidnapping, they arrest her like a criminal. So right away, they're not really making her feel like she can trust them. But again, consider that she'd been with these people for over a year and a half, being held against her will. Mm-hmm. There's so much psychological damage that can be done in that time. When they found her, she was in such rough shape. And again, just one day in a closet will drive you insane. But 57 days in a closet, being threatened with death, being sexually abused, and then being forced to adopt these ideals that this group has.
Mm-hmm. Patty was only 87 pounds when she was found, and she was described as zombie-like, showing little emotion or intelligence.
And yet, they hold her accountable for her decisions at the time of arrest. She was clearly abused and malnourished. Like, why would she only be 87 pounds if she was healthy? She wasn't thinking clearly. And the really big thing to me is that she was forced into this group by threat of death against her will, and she never intentionally hurt anyone. She never directly hurt anyone. Yeah, she shot at the side of a building, but that was to avoid shooting a person. Mm-hmm. She was kind to the person she carjacked from, and she was just a getaway driver in that bank robbery where Myrna was killed. She wasn't in there hurting anybody. So yeah, she was an accomplice to some really horrible things, but she was manipulated through a huge power imbalance and the threat of death into doing whatever this group wanted her to do. And sure, she may have put on a really good act for them. Even after Sinque was killed, she still had Bill to worry about. The fact that just Bill was free doesn't really reduce the risk of Patricia turning on SLA and what they would do to her if she did that.
I think what you're trying to say, too, is she had to put on that act, like you said. Mm-hmm. So when she got arrested, I'm sure it was really hard for her to stop putting on that act because it was something that she had grown to do to survive. It wasn't just a mask she could take on and off super easily. Like to survive, she had to become one of them. Mm-hmm.
People don't think about how psychologically broken she was at this time. She wasn't living under normal circumstances. She was in an extremely high-stress situation for 18 to 19 months.
At the time of her arrest, Patricia was not the same person she was when she was kidnapped. Her IQ had dropped from 130 to 112. She couldn't remember things from her life before. She smoked heavily, and she was plagued with horrible nightmares that kept her from getting adequate sleep.
I mean, not not getting enough sleep alone is enough to make you crazy, and all the other trauma, it's incredibly damaging. And yet to this day, so many people say she's not a victim, only a criminal, and it disgusts me. You need to look at the whole picture. And I can't argue the fact that she was a criminal, but her actions were coerced by an abusive power imbalance. Again, she never intentionally harmed anyone. She was just present when the people who kidnapped her harmed others.
But because of the time period and the lack of understanding of coercive control and abuse, since she didn't have a diagnosable mental illness or defect, and they determined she wasn't under constant threat of death while she was with the SLA, they determined she was fully responsible for her actions during this time.
Yeah, they determined that because they didn't understand. I mean, a lot of this can be blamed on the time period. Given what we know now about the psychological phenomena around abduction and abuse, this seems ridiculous to me, but I can understand why people had a hard time understanding it, because the time period was so different. They didn't have all these kidnapping cases to look back on and see how they were psychologically damaging to the victims. I mean, they were still using terms like brainwashed and Stockholm Syndrome, which are just gross oversimplifications of what's actually going on. Like, people describe Stockholm Syndrome as feeling compassion for your kidnapper, when in reality it's more like desperately looking for what you need to do to survive. If your life is in the hands of an evil person, people may need to put on an act just to survive. And brainwashing is similar. When someone has power over you, after taking away any power you have, brainwashed is a gross oversimplification, because a kidnapped victim has already learned that terrible things you never thought possible can happen to you. You know, after something like that happens, they can never trust that they'll be safe again. So how could she have gotten to a place where she could betray this group that has her under their control and trust that law enforcement would be able to keep her safe when they haven't done anything for her up to this point? And if you've never been kidnapped, you can't pretend to understand her thought process. So I know I don't understand it. That's for sure. So for people to continue to pretend that they can understand her and that she was in full control, it's ludicrous.
While Patricia sat in jail, she saw a psychiatrist who helped her start learning to think her own thoughts again. A few weeks after her arrest, Patricia renounced her SLA allegiance.
Yeah, and I think, again, another thing people don't consider is she was forced into, not being able to have independent thoughts for years. And this is something she had to relearn. It's how to think for herself with the help of the psychiatrist.
While waiting for trial, she went through multiple attorneys who all had different ideas for how to approach her defense. Her first lawyer just told her not to talk anymore, not even to psychiatrists. He wanted to lean on a defense of involuntary intoxication, saying that the SLA had given her drugs that affected her judgment and recollection. But he was replaced by a second attorney who wanted a defense based on the coercion and duress that she was under at the time. But she had already been told that this was, quote, not a defense when it comes to the law.
Okay, sure.
Patricia's trial for the Hibernia bank robbery, which took place 2 months after her abduction, was on January 15th, 1976.
So the judge, Oliver Jesse Carter, actually happened to be a friend of a junior member of the prosecution team. So that's interesting. It seems like a conflict of interest.
He ruled that the tapes and written statements from Patricia after this robbery and her actions as a fugitive were all voluntary. He didn't allow expert testimony for the stylistic analysis of the tapes and writings and how she was being controlled at the time of making them.
But he permitted the prosecution to introduce statements and actions from Patricia long after the robbery as evidence of her state of mind during the robbery, which doesn't seem very balanced to me.
He also allowed a recording from a conversation she had with a friend visiting her in jail, where she used profanity and spoke of her radical and feminist beliefs, but didn't allow tapes of her interview with a psychiatrist. People in the courtroom described the judge as, quote, resting his eyes during testimony, which would be in Patricia's favor.
So clearly this judge had a bias that was obvious to the court, not only in his attitude, but also in his decisions that would directly impact the outcome of the case.
When they talked about the robbery where she shot the storefront, she testified that she was regularly instructed about what to do in an emergency and that she didn't even think about it. She just did it. She said, quote, if I had not done it and if they had been able to get away, they would have killed me. She also talked about how she was writing about her sexual encounters with Willie Wolfe, and she had been punched in the face by William Harris when she first regarded it as sexual abuse.
So, obviously, she was being physically controlled into writing and saying whatever they want her to on the tapes and writings. I mean, if you listen to the tapes, again, you can hear almost between every sentence, there's a loud pop, which is a cut in the tape where she paused it, possibly rewound and recorded over what she said before. Mm-hmm. Basically, they probably had her rehearse and record each sentence until it sounded perfect to them. But again, we went into more detail on when we talked about the tapes.
Mm-hmm. But despite all this, Patricia reportedly made a poor impression and appeared lethargic during the trial.
Well, she's probably frustrated with how biased the judge is.
Right, resting his eyes. A month after the trial started, in February of 1976, a bomb had gone off in the Hearst Castle, shortly after she provided information on the SLA activities and plans.
So what does that tell you?
That they're there.
They're all
watching.
Yeah, they still have control over her because now they're hearing that she's turning on them and providing information. Mm-hmm. So this proves that, she either had the option to be with them or dead.
Mm-hmm. After Hearst testified about Willie Wolfe raping her, Emily Harris did an interview from jail saying that Patricia kept a trinket that Willie gave her, and that proves that they were in a romantic relationship.
What do you think of that?
I think that is bull beep.
Bull beep. Yeah, again, when people pretend to understand kidnap victims, it disgusts me because maybe this was just one of those few personal possessions she had, and in her mind it was completely detached from Willie, who gave it to her, and she just liked it and wanted to keep it as her little trinket because it was one of the only things she owned.
Well, and maybe unfortunately she was raped by Willie, obviously, but she did have some type of emotional attachment to him.
Oh yeah. So, again, even if...
But why can you blame the victim for that? That's very unfair.
Right? Again, if sex has a power imbalance, if you're coercing someone into sex using some type of power imbalance, that's rape. So even if she appeared to be consensual after being kidnapped, that's still rape.
Mm-hmm. She later said she kept it because she thought it could have some archaeological significance.
But again, this is what she said after people were basically forcing her to come up with an excuse.
And some of the jury regarded this as powerful evidence that she was lying.
Wow.
In the prosecution's closing statements, it was barely acknowledged that she'd been kidnapped and held captive, and instead asserted that she'd committed these crimes without coercion, and said that because fellow SLA members were feminists, they would not have allowed her to be raped. Oh my gosh.
Come on, people. Like, they probably wouldn't have allowed Emily to shoot and kill Myrna either then. Mm-hmm. Why?
Right.
Like, Myrna was a woman. Why would feminists shoot and kill her? But this whole trial just seems like complete garbage. So what happened? What was the end result of this trial?
On March 20th, 1976, Patty was convicted of bank robbery and using a firearm during the commission of a felony. She was given the maximum sentence of 35 years.
No leniency.
She began serving her sentence, but Patty had a rough time. One of her lungs collapsed while she was there, and she needed emergency surgery.
Which shows the physical condition she was in after all this.
This prevented her from being able to testify against the Harris couple.
So pretty much up until this point, everything that has happened has been against Patricia, not in her favor. But finally, she found some justice in this case. So what happened?
Well, after going through a lengthy appeal process and serving 22 months in prison, her charges were actually commuted by the president at the time, Jimmy Carter. In 1979, she was released under stringent conditions, remaining on probation for the original length of the sentence. But on January 20th, 2001, on his last day in office, President Bill Clinton actually granted her a full pardon.
Which was a long time coming. She started as a kidnap victim in 1974 and literally spent the next 5 years until 1979 as a captive of somebody. A lot of people still see her as a criminal, and they see the fact that she was pardoned by Bill Clinton as a privilege she has because her family is so wealthy. And that may be true. She definitely has benefited a little bit from her family's wealth, and someone without the same wealth in the same situation would have probably had a much more difficult time recovering from the situation, if at all. But she was also kidnapped because of the wealth. The wealth put a huge target on her back.
That's a really good point.
And having a bunch of money doesn't change the horrific events she suffered. Money doesn't take away pain, and it doesn't turn you from being a human being. You still suffer pain. It doesn't change the fact that she was a prisoner of the legal system even longer than she was a prisoner of her kidnappers, even though she was the victim the whole time. The advantages she was born into and had no control over doesn't mean it didn't still hurt her, and it wasn't still horribly unfair.
Right. I think, unfortunately for Patty Hearst, in that generation, people that remember this case don't care to find justice for her. They just took what they found from the media of her being a kidnappee turned criminal, and that's that. Move on.
Yeah, we did a little case study on that this morning. Your aunt popped in, and she asked what case we were working on, and I told her Patty Hearst and asked if she heard of it because it was a pretty high-profile case in the 70s. And she's like, oh yeah, isn't she the one who joined that group that kidnapped her? And that's all the general public remember of her because they remember what the media painted.
And if there's not going to be a huge recap from the media or a huge breakthrough, this is what actually happened, then people from that generation are most likely not going to dig it up for themselves.
Right.
So
that's exactly why when I saw the synopsis of this case and then I started to dig into it, because I wanted to prove to myself, if I could, that these people had a point, that she was in the wrong. But after going through everything I could find, it's just so many textbook things of a kidnap victim and things that we understand now that she was misunderstood for because of the time period it happened in. So anyway, this has been a long episode. We've been recording for 2 hours. Actually, 3 hours, if you count Patreon.
We do. So
I have a lot of editing to do. Hopefully I can get this posted on time. And yeah, we thank you guys so much for listening. Do you have anything to say before we wrap it up?
I need to put my brain on ice.
Yeah, you're tired after all that recording. I understand. But, you know what we haven't done in a long time is shout out our social media. We always forget.
Oh, yeah, you can check out our posts on Instagram at BOV Podcast. That's what it is. Our handle, right? And
email us at vovpodcast@gmail.com. We're on Twitter at vovpod.
Yeah.
And we have t-shirts
We do have t-shirts.
Threadless.com/VOV podcast.
If you sign up to be a patron, then you have a chance to win one of those t-shirts every month.
Yeah. And very soon we'll be sharing the winner of this month's t-shirt. So stay tuned for that.
And if you wouldn't mind, be a sub on our YouTube page, because we just have 200 more to go.
Well, to get 1,000. Yeah, we just crossed 1,800.
Yeah.
Not 1,800. 800 so, YouTube subscribers, which is really cool.
If it's
so thank you guys for listening on YouTube.
Yeah, that'd be really sweet if that happened.
I do want to apologize there's someone who listens on YouTube who has commented, like, share comments from YouTube, like the way we share reviews. And I want to, but the way YouTube's set up, it's so hard to find older comments. So I'm struggling to find the reviews that this particular person has left in the past in YouTube comments. So I'm sorry for that. If you could remind me what video they're on, I'd really appreciate it. I'm sorry.
It's really funny.
All right. Anyway, we're just a couple of dumb kids.
Dumb.
Cool. Well, thank you for listening again, and we will talk to you next week.
Bye.